The alarm cut through the hatchery before I even understood what I was hearing. A thin, cracking whine, so sharp it felt like it was scraping the inside of my skull, and my badge was still beeping red at a door I had no permission to open. I was not supposed to be there. Nobody with my clearance was ever supposed to be there. The Sovereign hatchery sat behind 3 checkpoints, guarded day and night, because the egg inside it was worth more than every ship docked at the station combined. I had wandered close only because the corridor was quiet, and my shift had ended early, and now I was standing in front of a door that was not fully shut, listening to a sound that made my chest hurt. I pushed it open before I could stop myself. The chamber inside was dim, lit by a soft blue glow from the walls, and in the center of it, resting on a bed of warm stone, sat the egg everyone on this station had been waiting 11 years to see hatch. It was cracking, but wrong, the seam jagged and uneven, stuck halfway, and the creature inside was crying out in that same broken whine, over and over, with nobody around to help it. The whole observation staff had gone to the unveiling 3 buildings away. 11 years of silence had made them careless on the one day it finally mattered. I should have called someone. I should have backed out and reported it. Instead, I climbed over the low rail meant to keep visitors back, and I walked straight up to the egg, because the sound coming from it was the loneliest thing I had ever heard, and I could not make myself turn away from it. I placed both hands on the warm shell. "I have got you," I said, feeling foolish the moment the words left my mouth. "You are not stuck forever. I am here." I found the jagged seam with my fingers and pulled gently, the way I imagined someone would help a small bird escape a shell too tight for it. The crack gave way all at once. Heat rolled out over my hands and arms, and then 2 enormous golden eyes opened only inches from my face, eyes far too large for the small head they belonged to. Nobody had ever explained to me what happens in that first moment, because nobody who was not part of this world had ever been close enough to see it. It was not a switch flipping. It was more like watching something decide, in an instant, that I was the first solid thing it had ever known, and something inside me decided the very same thing right back. She made a low sound in her throat, climbed up my arm on wet, trembling legs, and pressed her head under my chin, as if she had done it 1,000 times before instead of only once, only now, only seconds old. That was the exact moment the door burst open and a dozen people in ceremonial robes walked in to present their 4th-century miracle to nobles from 6 different star systems, and found it wrapped tightly around the neck of an ordinary station worker instead. There was no polite silence. There was shouting in 3 different languages at once, one noble falling straight into a table of flowers, and a guard reaching for his weapon, before an older woman threw her arm out and said one sharp word that froze the entire room. "Stop." Her name, I would learn later, was Margaret Ashby, head of the hatchery program, and she had seen something in the hatchling's posture that none of the panicking nobles had noticed. Wings half spread, small body curled protectively around my neck, a low, continuous sound aimed at every stranger in the room except me. She knew, the way every keeper on this station apparently knew, that a creature like this would rather stop breathing than be pulled away from what it had just chosen, and forcing the matter would leave them with nothing worth having. So instead, she walked toward me slowly, palms open, the way someone approaches an animal that might bolt. "Do you understand what you are holding?" she asked, her voice careful and quiet. "A very frightened baby," I answered, because it was the only true thing I had to give her. Something shifted behind her eyes, not the anger I expected, something closer to sorrow, and beneath the sorrow, something that looked almost like relief. "We tried everything," she said. "Scent training, bloodline matching, handlers raised from childhood for this single purpose, taught the correct tone of voice, the correct way to stand, the correct words in the old language." She paused. 11 years preparing the ideal candidate, and she bonded, in less than 2 minutes, to a man who does not even know our alphabet. "I did not do anything special," I said, and the hatchling pressed harder into my neck, as if she were offended on my behalf. "You did the one thing none of them did," Margaret said quietly. "You did not walk in here hoping to claim her. You walked in because she was scared, and you never stopped to ask whether you were allowed to help." Nobody in that room truly believed at first that it would last. Over the following days, there were 3 separate attempts to introduce what they called more suitable candidates. A decorated commander named Gregory Wells, calm and steady, who had led rescue missions across half the sector. 2 young relatives of ruling families, dressed in fine robes meant to impress. And finally a diplomat named Vincent Hale, whose voice was so smooth and even that the staff believed it alone might soothe her. She did not harm any of them. She simply refused. She turned her back on the commander, ignored the young relatives entirely, and when the diplomat reached toward her with practiced confidence, she gave him a firm warning bite. Nothing serious, just enough to make her point completely clear. Margaret told me afterward, with what I am fairly certain was quiet amusement, that the diplomat had left the station within the hour. They ran every scan available anyway, because someone in that hierarchy needed an explanation that fit neatly into numbers instead of feelings. What they discovered did nothing to support their case for undoing what had already happened. Creatures of her bloodline did not bond through training or scent or careful preparation at all. According to records passed down for centuries, they bonded through something the old text called the first true reaching, a moment when someone steps forward not to gain something for themselves, but simply to free another creature from fear. 4 centuries of careful preparation across every noble house, and the only quality that had ever truly mattered was one nobody had thought to train for at all: the simple act of showing up for someone else's fear before stopping to ask permission. I still did not understand what I was supposed to do with a hatchling worth more, politically, than most of the ships docked at the station. I did not know the ceremonies. I did not know the traditions a bonded human was expected to learn. I was corrected, gently but constantly, by people who had spent their entire lives around creatures like her, and clearly found my ignorance both concerning and, slowly, rather endearing. But every night she curled tightly around my ribs, as though I were the only steady thing in the entire universe, and every morning those enormous golden eyes opened and looked at me exactly the way they had the very first time, as if I were still the one who had reached in and freed her. It turned out that was not a small thing to be. Her name, chosen not by me but by her own instinct somehow, translated roughly into something like Ember, and within a month the entire station knew her by that name alone. She grew fast, faster than any hatchling on record, and every week brought a new complication nobody had prepared me for. She refused food unless I sat beside her. She would not sleep unless my hand rested against her side. When engineers tried to move her temporary shelter closer to the research wing for observation, she flattened it with a single sweep of her tail and dragged herself, and somehow me along with her, back toward my own quarters instead. Margaret Ashby began visiting almost daily, not to test us anymore, but simply to watch. She told me once that in 400 years there had never been a bonded pair quite like ours, not because I was special in any grand sense, but because everyone before me had approached the bonding as something to be earned, a prize to be unlocked through the correct performance. I had approached it as nothing more than helping something that needed help. She said that difference mattered more than any bloodline or training ever could. The trouble began, as trouble often does, with people who could not accept that the matter was already settled. A representative from one of the ruling families, a woman named Charlotte Price, arrived on the station 3 weeks after the hatching, insisting that the bonding be reviewed and potentially reversed. She argued that a creature of Ember's value belonged with someone raised specifically for the responsibility, someone who understood diplomacy, history, and the delicate balance between noble houses. She was polite in her words but firm in her intention, and she brought with her a small team determined to prove that the bond could be broken if enough pressure was applied in the right places. They tried separating us for what they called a short evaluation period, moving Ember to a different chamber under careful supervision, while I was kept elsewhere on the station. It lasted less than 6 hours. Ember refused to eat, refused to rest, and eventually forced her way through a reinforced door that had been rated to hold far larger animals than her, causing considerable alarm among the staff but, thankfully, no harm to anyone. She found her way through 3 sealed corridors until she reached the maintenance section where I had been asked to wait, and the moment she saw me she pressed herself against me and would not move for nearly an hour, trembling the entire time. That single event ended any further talk of reversing the bond. Charlotte Price left the station a few days later, though she made it clear before departing that she still believed the situation was unwise. Margaret told me privately that Charlotte's concern was not cruelty, simply a lifetime spent believing that value and preparation always determined outcome, and it had shaken her deeply to watch instinct override every rule she had trusted her whole career. Life afterward found a strange rhythm. I kept my old duties around the station, though my schedule was adjusted to allow time with Ember each day. Since separation longer than a few hours clearly caused her distress, she grew steadily, and within 2 months she was already large enough to walk beside me through the wider corridors, rather than needing to be carried. Children living on the station would gather at a respectful distance to watch her pass, and she seemed to enjoy the attention, often slowing her steps and lowering her head so the smaller ones could see her better, something none of the handlers had ever taught her to do. It was during this time that I met someone who would become important in an entirely different way. Her name was Grace Whitfield, a young researcher assigned to study Ember's development, patient and thoughtful in a way that made the long hours of observation feel less like work and more like conversation. She never treated Ember as a specimen to measure, only as a creature learning about the world, and she never once suggested that my bond with Ember was something that needed correcting or explaining. She simply accepted it, and in doing so, she made the strange new shape of my life feel a little less overwhelming. Grace and I spent many evenings together while Ember rested nearby, talking about the old records of previous bonded pairs, most of which ended in tragedy or disappointment because the humans involved had been chosen for status rather than character. She told me that in every case she had studied, the pairs who lasted longest were never the ones who tried hardest to be worthy. They were the ones who simply stayed present, day after day, without expecting anything in return. That thought stayed with me through the months that followed, especially during the more difficult stretches of Ember's growth, when her strength began to outpace her understanding of it. She once knocked over a supply cart without meaning to, startled by a sudden noise, and stood frozen afterward looking so distressed by the mess she had caused that I had to sit with her for nearly an hour just to calm her down. She learned quickly after that to control her movements more carefully, watching me closely whenever something unexpected happened, as though checking to see whether I was upset before deciding how to feel about it herself. By the time 6 months had passed, Ember had grown large enough that the station needed to reconsider where she could comfortably live, and Margaret Ashby proposed moving us both to a wider section near the outer ring, where there was more open space and better access to natural light through the observation windows. I agreed, mostly because Ember seemed to genuinely enjoy watching the stars drift past whenever we walked near those windows, often stopping entirely just to look, her head tilted in quiet wonder. It was near those same windows, several weeks after the move, that the station received word of a small transport vessel in distress not far from our position, its engines failing after a minor malfunction, drifting slowly and without power. Rescue teams were dispatched immediately, but the vessel's location made a direct approach difficult for the larger station ships. Margaret came to find me that evening, explaining calmly that Ember's ability to fly and navigate tight spaces without mechanical limitations might allow her to reach the transport faster than any standard rescue shuttle, if I was willing to go with her. I did not hesitate, though my hands were shaking as I climbed onto her back for the very first time, guided by instructions from the rescue team over a small communicator fixed to my ear. Ember seemed to understand the urgency the moment we lifted off, moving with a steadiness I had not expected from a creature not yet a year old, cutting through the dark toward the drifting vessel with a focus that told me she understood, somehow, exactly what was needed of her. We reached the transport well ahead of the rescue shuttles, and Ember hovered carefully beside the damaged hull while I helped guide the 2 frightened passengers inside toward an emergency hatch, a young engineer named Oliver Grant and an older technician named Louise Bennett, both shaken but unharmed. Ember carried all 3 of us back toward the station with a gentleness that surprised even Margaret when we landed, setting us down as carefully as though she were afraid the ground itself might hurt us. That night, sitting quietly beside her while she rested from the effort, I finally understood something I had not fully grasped before. She had not simply chosen me because I had freed her from the shell all those months ago. She had chosen a way of seeing the world, one where helping came first and recognition came only afterward, if it came at all, and somewhere along the way she had made that same way of seeing her own. Margaret Ashby retired from the hatchery program not long after, satisfied, she said, that the record of our bond had already answered every question the old traditions had failed to explain in 400 years. Grace Whitfield stayed on as the station's lead researcher for creatures like Ember, and our conversations in the evenings slowly became something more than friendship, something neither of us rushed but both seemed to welcome. As for Ember, she grew into exactly what the old records had promised a creature of her bloodline could become: steady, fiercely protective, and endlessly curious about the smaller lives around her. She never stopped sleeping curled against my side each night, no matter how much larger she grew, and she never stopped looking at me each morning the same way she had the very first time her eyes opened, as though I were still the one reaching in to free her from something she could not escape alone. I never became the diplomat or commander the old houses believed she deserved. I remained, in every way that mattered, exactly who I had been, the day I heard a small cracking sound behind a door I was never supposed to open. It turned out that was enough. It turned out, more than enough. It was everything she had ever truly needed.